Welcome to the Worldwise Wealth Podcast. I'm your host, Nicole, and this podcast is your guide to building a truly borderless life. From entrepreneurship, investment migration, tax optimization, and everything in between, this show highlights the nuances of a global citizen lifestyle. Let's dive in. Today's episode is an episode that I was a guest on the Globetrotters podcast. Now, in this episode where I starred on their show, we dive into global citizen optimization, how I have traveled the world for so long, built my business, and how we work with clients to make them tax-free or lower their taxes while also obtaining diversification options through residency, citizenship, and banking. So we really touch on the core points of what you need to be successful, but also to get started as a global citizen in this episode. So let's dive in.
Today, we're going to be speaking with Nicole. She is a creator, a host of a work, wealth, and travel podcast. She is an experienced global citizen who embarked on her journey almost a decade ago, leaving her home country behind to secure a better financial future for herself.
With a background as an expat, full-time traveler, and now a diversified global citizen, she offers valuable expertise in assisting clients with residency, relocation, tax optimization, and citizenship acquisition.
Having visited over 40 countries, Nicole has a deep understanding of different lifestyles, cultures, and the opportunities they can offer. Today, she's going to walk us through the benefits of residency relocation, its tax impact, and obtaining new citizenships. She specializes in creating custom plans for small businesses and freelancers to leverage global opportunities and secure their financial future. In some ways, you could sum it up with a famous saying, "Don't work for the money, let the money work for you." Nicole, thank you for joining the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to diving into this episode.
We're happy to have you, Nicole. You started this journey over a decade ago, and you have fully embraced nomadic lifestyle. And we want to know, what was that turning point that kind of made you decide to live and work this way?
Yes, so the journey started almost a decade ago, which is wild because time really flies. But to sum up really where it all started for me was I took the traditional path that I think we are all told that we're supposed to take. I think in the last few years this has changed, but this was well before 2020. And went to university, got all of the things, the accolades, collected them that you're supposed to get, and then started life in the corporate world. And after only about 6 months' time, I realized that this was what the rest of my life looked like. I was 21 years old and I realized I would be doing this until I retire, bar a few holidays per year to probably Mexico or somewhere not too far from Canada. And I really realized that that was not the lifestyle that I wanted to lead. And so I looked at what my options were, and I ended up pretty quickly moving to China, took the first job that was available to me. And my mindset at the time was the worst that can happen is that it doesn't work out in China, go back to Canada, regroup, and then go elsewhere. And is that really the worst case scenario? No. So I ended up moving to China, absolutely loved it, lived there for 4 years, got locked out, unfortunately, during the pandemic, stuck in Canada. That gave me some time to really reflect on what I wanted in life. And I realized I was essentially doing the same thing I was doing in Canada, but now I was just doing it in China. I was still working a 9 to 5. I was still working for somebody else, but I was enjoying life a lot more in China. But it still wasn't really what I truly wanted. So I embarked on the journey of figuring out my own personal residency and tax optimize and banking situation, leaving Canada as a resident. And now for the last few years, we have helped clients all over the globe to do something similar.
I just want to say I'm really impressed of the mentality that you exhibited at such an early age, because that is true what you said. Worst case scenario, I come back to Canada and it didn't work out, but I still think that fear of failure still holds so many people back. And so I just want to applaud you for that. But, one thing that I want to discuss, we've had a lot of digital nomads on this podcast. a lot. But you said there's a distinction between digital nomads and true global citizens. Can you explain that distinction?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I do get sometimes controversy around that. And really, it comes down to what you define as a global citizen and a digital nomad. But what I see with a lot of expats in general, let's say, is they'll fall into two different categories. And so, the way that I view it and the way that I make distinctions for clients as well, because we really help out global citizens to form a life abroad, not to live abroad for a few years or a decade and then potentially settle down or return home. Whereas a digital nomad is somebody who is really looking to travel, to live a life abroad. Maybe you have one or two home bases, maybe you don't have a home base at all, but you still have ties to a country and it usually is your home country. Whereas when you become a global citizen is really when you have thought about what the future holds for you and you know that your home country is likely no longer in the books. And so that typically involves cutting ties. It can be cutting the tie of your citizenship. It can be cutting the tie of healthcare, whatever. It looks different for every country, but whatever your country is, cutting the ties with that country and then really establishing ties abroad, which is not necessarily always as easy as establishing one residency, one bank account, working your way towards citizenship in one country. Typically, our clients and what I consider global citizens really want to diversify and have their eggs in one basket. If you've heard of flag theory, that would be a good example as to having your residence somewhere, your company elsewhere, your citizenships elsewhere, and your banking and investments elsewhere.
Max, based on that definition, when you left to Colombia before COVID, because you were kind of in a similar situation, based on her definition, would you still classify yourself as a digital nomad or a global citizen?
I think I was actually debating this in my head while she was explaining it. I would think I would fall more so under global citizen because a digital nomad, in my eyes, is someone who's going to be working for a company based in one country, but is working abroad while traveling and kind of holding down their ties to that country. Right? Do I have that somewhat correct there? Okay, I'll go with the yes on that. So that's why I would say I'm more of like a global citizen if I were to do that tour company back in the day. What would you say, John? I'm interested to feel like.
Well, I mean, I think it's as Nicole kind of said, like I guess where does the controversy stir amongst your audience when you bring up this topic? Because I think I see the distinction. I may not necessarily agree 100%, but I do see a distinction for sure. So I'm curious, where do your listeners, where's the controversy amongst your fan base?
Well, it's tricky because it is different for every individual person, quite honestly. And I will say with that, that being an American, you're always going to likely have ties. So that's when
For
the
sure.
distinction becomes a little bit more difficult, even if you do have an entirely different life set up abroad, but you still hold that citizenship. So that's when it becomes a little bit tricky. And we do work with quite a few Americans. But yeah, I find the controversy really just comes from a lot of nomads or even global citizens who are saying, I've lived abroad for 10 or 20 years. They're still tied to their home country. They're still potentially paying taxes there. Okay, they're global citizens in their eyes. I mean, I really just use that definition when working with clients to figure out, is this a trajectory and a path that you want to go down now? Because what's your medium to long term look like instead of just looking at the short term?
Mm,
Yeah, and that is where I see the distinction for sure. So
yeah,
brilliant.
Thank you
I
for
think it's also
explaining that.
important. Yeah, I feel like I could hear it like 3 more times still just to get a better grip on it. But like I think it's important for people to realize that it can fluctuate. It's not like you choose. It's not a red or blue pill, right? It can change over time. But like Nicole said, it just kind of depends on what their goal is and what they're looking for. And speaking on goals for people who want to kind of take on this change in their life to be a true global citizen or digital nomad, you've helped clients from countries like the US and the UK and Australia transition to living abroad. What's the most common fear, or if there's another misconception people have when thinking about leaving their home country? And how do you help them overcome it or possibly question it further so that they get closure out of those misconceptions and fears?
That's a good question. Quite honestly, it's interesting you repeating that to me because I feel like a lot of clients typically will come to us and they know that they are ready to typically leave their home country, but definitely to start diversifying. Um, so I feel like a lot of the clients that we work with, they have questions, but more questions and less fearful around what is the future going to look like for me. I will say I'm Canadian. We work with a lot of Canadians, and in not in the US, but in systems similar to Canada. When you're leaving as a non-resident, becoming a non-resident and leaving the country, you have to cut quite a few ties, and one of those includes healthcare. And so I see some of the ties, and I mean in Canada and a few other countries around the globe, you have what I'm going to put this in air quotes, what is called, universal free healthcare. In my eyes, you are most certainly paying for it in various ways with your time and your money. But, I guess that could be debated for some, probably my parents who live in Canada full time and will never leave. But yeah, I think it's less fear, but just more questions. And then really the life that they knew, and let's say the free healthcare, the understanding of the tax system and what they're supposed to do each year and be filing and just life in general can be fearful to leave and have all of these changes at one time. And I mean, I've experienced myself personally in various different countries where I've lived longer term, but that's why it's really important to have somebody to guide you along the way. And we work with partners in every country that we operate in, which is over 20 countries at this point, most of them beneficial for residencies or tax optimized or banking, beneficial in some way or another to our clients, but really having somebody who understands what they're going through and to walk them through every step of the process.
Have you guys ever considered it, like leaving, kind of the same way that Nicole did?
Definitely not in the same way. Mine was much more less. There was less planning going on when I was considering it.
You
I mean,
weren't
Yeah.
trying to
Chelsea.
optimize your taxes, it seems.
Yeah.
As I'm listening to Nicole talk about this whole process, I'm just like, you know what? Where could I go? Where would I want to go? I mean, Canada, I can literally see it right across my, the river's right there and I can see it. Um, but in terms of like, where would I actually want to go and live and how would I ever want to start that process? I'm like, you've really got my wheels spinning. So I'm sure there's probably some listeners too that are thinking the same thing, right?
And I asked this question because I did, after visiting Argentina for the first time, my wife and I really did consider it at the time. It was just such a suave lifestyle, and like we really loved it that we actually started exploring the prospects of like, what if we bought property here? What if we decided to just like pick up and leave and move to Buenos Aires? Like, what would that look like? And correct me if I'm wrong, Nicole, you would obviously know better than I would, but it's my understanding that if I were to try to transition into Argentina currently, they don't have like the tax code or whatever is really messy. So I would actually get taxed twice in both countries if I don't like rescind full citizenship. Does that sound about right? Or am I like confusing?
It's not that the tax code is messy in Argentina. I mean, the law and what is in practice are somewhat two different things, especially within Latin America, but it's really just that it's a very high tax jurisdiction. So it's usually not beneficial for most in terms of tax optimization. Now, that's kind of where I differentiate tax optimization and lifestyle because both are equally as important. And so for you, you travel to Buenos Aires, you're in Argentina, you absolutely enjoy it. Okay, paying tax for a few years, potentially longer, may make sense just depending on what your end goal is hoping to look like, may make sense for you, right? Because not only are we talking about tax optimization, we're also talking about lifestyle and obtaining residencies so that you can legally live in a country that you enjoy, like Argentina, for example, for the long term, not simply be on a tourist visa, having to do tourist runs or whatnot. So there's those two components that really come into play when we're working with clients. There are some countries that are amazing and offer great tax benefits, in which case that's great, but that's not always the case. So we have to figure out where they want to spend time, where are their taxes going to be based, if at all possible, if you're not American, and then go from there.
And is there kind of this medium that you try to play in terms of getting the most in terms of optimizing your taxes with the life balance or lifestyle balance? Or do some people tend to be like, hey, I just care about optimizing excuse my French, the shit out of this, and I can live anywhere. Where some people are more particular about one or the other. How have you found your clients to operate?
Yeah, usually again both components come into play. So not every country in the globe offers a somewhat straightforward path to residency, other than simply just spending quite a bit of time there. And then quite a few, I would say almost most countries in the globe do not offer very interesting tax incentives, especially if you're a new resident coming in. So that's where, let's say Panama is a very interesting jurisdiction within Latin America that we do a lot of work in. It's a great lifestyle that many clients actually are already spending a lot of time there. And so it works from a tax optimization perspective. In your case, Argentina, okay, doesn't work from a tax perspective, but we can still optimize your taxes in another jurisdiction that makes sense. Depending on the jurisdiction, you may not have to spend as much time there. You can spend some places as little as 1 or 2 days per year there. Some places, a few months. Yes, there is very much so depends on the jurisdiction. But then, yes, you're paying taxes in Argentina. That's only going to be for a few years. You get the citizenship. And then we can work toward, you already have the citizenship. You've become a non-resident in Argentina. Okay, what does the rest of the plan look like for you? So I will say with most clients, it's not just a one country solution. There's a tax optimized solution, and then there are various different residencies and countries that are of interest to the client. So we're working on various different pieces of the puzzle at once.
You had my curiosity. Now you have my full attention.
Hey Globetrotters, Chelsea here. I have a couple of questions for you. Do you want to travel but have no one to go with? Are you passionate about adventure and the outdoors? If the answer is yes, join us for a group trip on the stunning coast of Colombia, February 22nd through the 28th of 2025. Picture this. You're hiking through the jungle. You're swimming beneath waterfalls, motorbiking along the coast, island hopping, and you're immersing yourself in Colombian culture. Sounds good? I think so too. We'll be exploring Cartagena and Santa Marta, the biggest cities of northern Colombia, as well as the more local coastal towns like Costeño Beach and Palomino, with plenty of activities along the way. We'll take care of all transportation, 13 meals, the coastal motorcycle tour, a private boat charter, and more. Whether you're traveling solo or in a group, join us in February to kick off 2025 with adventure and make some new friends along the way. Starting at $18.95 USD with both single and double room occupancy available. This is your sign to say yes to adventure and being part of the Globetrotters travel community. Spots are limited, so don't wait. Head over to gtspodcast.com to reserve your spot. And now, back to the episode.
I kind of want to just piggyback off of that. How do you specifically guide clients through the process of picking the right country for residency or business, especially when different places have unique tax and lifestyle benefits? Do you have a specific SOP in place, or I'm imagining it's case by case? But could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, for sure. It's very much so a case by case, because every client, what they're looking for lifestyle is different, but also the business that they already have established, where those clients are coming from, even small things like their payment processing system looks different. So there are Asia, not so much. There are a few jurisdictions in Europe that are interesting, quite honestly, but most of our clients are interested in Latin America because it is much more, right now at least, this won't last forever, but it is very much so quote unquote up and coming market in terms of, yes, there are a few countries, definitely not every country, of course, that's the case in every continent, that are interesting for taxes, but then there are also much more affordable, quite honestly, residency solutions. So it looks different on a case by case basis. I would say in Europe, you're usually looking at starting at $500,000 to $1 million if you're really looking to invest, have tax optimized structures. In Latin America, I mean, it varies depending on the country, but it can start with as little as 5 or 10,000, and then definitely going up to 300,000, 500,000. But it also depends, on the client. Are they heavy in crypto? Is most of their money in one or two businesses? Where are those businesses based? Are they looking to set up a trust or a foundation? That's definitely not something that you can do that in almost every country. Not going to be something that's beneficial in most countries in Latin America and in Europe. So you really have to structure based on the client. So to answer your question, typically there is no one SOP that we follow. There is a guideline of questions and understanding the client's lifestyle and their business so that we can understand this is what's going to make the most sense, present that to them, and then from there fine tooth, like, I don't plan on spending any time in this country. This country is not of interest. This country is of great interest. Usually Mexico is one of those countries where people want to have a little bit longer time to stay in. But yeah, it usually just starts with a consult and then we go from there.
And Nicole, you've worked in over 20 countries. So for someone that might be interested in making this type of leap, what are those first practical steps, like getting residency or setting up a business, that they should really focus on? And like, how long does that process usually take? Does it depend on the country that you're looking at?
Yeah, it's funny. I actually had a call with a client today who was mentioning, like, I was just about to start an LLC. So should I wait for now? And the answer was yes, definitely
Yeah.
wait. There's other structures that need to come before just blindly setting up an LLC. Yes. So typically it depends on if the client has traveled, if the client is planning to travel, or if they're really looking for one, two, or three home bases around the globe. Typically, in terms of residency, you have quite a few options depending on how you want to qualify, how much you're looking to invest. See which countries are of interest for you to actually spend time in. Now, to counter that, I'm also a very big proponent of diversification. So all of these residency programs that are on the table now, I mean, even just in the last month, but definitely in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen pretty significant changes in a lot of them, with changing the documentation needed for the process. It'll always become more difficult. The pricing going up in terms of how much you need to qualify. The pricing in general of fees increases usually every year. So the options that are on the table now are not going to look the same in 6 months, and likely not in 12 or 24 months. So the lifestyle component is part of it, yes, but I'm also a big proponent of having diversification in some of these countries where it's not going to cost you $1 million plus in order to get residency now, where it may very well cost quite a bit more, not necessarily $1 million, but quite a bit
Mm-hmm.
more in the future. So while the residencies are still on the table, take advantage of them. If it's a country that you're on the fence, just get it, take advantage of it, especially if it's a pretty low cost option. You're looking at like 5, 10, 20,000 to get in. Pretty low cost that I can guarantee you in 1 or 2 years' time is going to look different.
You talk about some of these processes changing over time, which makes sense. I mean, governments are always implementing new laws that either make it easier or harder for tourists, expats, whatever you want to call it, like come into the country. But if we were to put kind of like like how often and how quickly are we seeing these changes in real time? At least since you started this business, is there kind of like a clear cut example of something you can point to, like in Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay, where it's changed drastically in a few years?
Absolutely. Yeah. So of course, every country and the government in each country, it's not going to, well, actually in Mexico, there is an increase every year in the amount that you need in order to qualify for residency, but it's not something that typically happens every year on the first of the year. Usually the government will say this change is going to be implemented within the next few months. And then you have a few months, if you would like, to get in on that option. So the Caribbean just happened this summer, where most of the base prices, just for the basic donation, not with investment in real estate. Great example where they started at 100,000, and now the minimum benchmark. I mean, this wasn't all the Caribbean; it was a lot of pressure from the EU and a few other bodies, but now it's starting at 200,000. So doubled in price, and that's just the absolute minimum. You're looking at around 300 with legal fees. So that's one good example. Another example that I really loved, because it's just such a great illustration, is about 2 or 3 years ago, you could very easily get residence in Panama, which is, of course, great for tax optimization, but you were able to put $5,000 into a bank account, residency, done. Easy. So there's almost no country that offers something that is as straightforward as that anymore. And now the easiest option to start obtaining residency in Panama, you're looking at around $10,000 to $20,000. So not a crazy fee, but it is different than a $5,000 just bank deposit. It's still your own money and done. And then you have a company formation, you have some social security that you have to pay into that and whatnot. So there are some additional annual fees along with the initial setup. So that's a great illustration that I like to use because it was essentially a free residency at one point, and that's just completely off the table.
Yeah. And speaking of residency, I kind of want to pivot to, some challenges for Americans, right? Like you've mentioned that the US has some unique challenges when it comes to taxation for citizens that are, living abroad. And I'm curious, like, what are some of those differences for Americans? And I guess, like, at what point does it make sense for them to explore leaving the US for tax purposes?
Yeah, good question. So I believe you're American, Chels, and I'm sure any
Yep.
American nomad will know that I think it's just extremely unfair. And I mean, if we got into it more, I would probably get a little bit angry about it. But the government, you unfortunately, if you hold the citizenship, not even the passport, just the citizenship or a green card, then you need to pay taxes regardless of where you're residing in the world or how long you're residing for.
Yeah.
So we do have clients who are looking to renounce, and there's a lot of pieces to that puzzle that come into play. But there
Hmm.
also are many clients who choose to continue paying taxes in the US, and there are certain ways to lower it depending on your business structure. But because they want access to the US. I mean, the US also has a great banking system, great financial system, very low percentage if you're looking to get loans or mortgages, especially when you're comparing that to the rest of the globe for the most part. And then, of course, you have the personal reason of going back anytime you would like to see family or friends. So it's a big decision. Typically, now it depends if you're going to be considered a covered or an uncovered expat when you're looking to leave the US. So when you know that the business is going to, or you personally are going to have around 2 million, that's when it starts to make sense to look to renounce before you hit that mark. But then that comes with a whole other host of challenges of where you're renouncing from. You can't have no citizenship. So you do need to first obtain citizenship from elsewhere before renouncing your US citizenship. There's now a larger fee than there has been in the past over the last couple of years to renounce. And then there's wait times as well to consider. And that just depends on where you are going, where you're booking the appointments from which country in order to start the renunciation process. But yeah, they definitely don't make it as easy as they used to.
Yeah. And this is so informative. Thank you.
Yeah.
As like a fellow American, I'm thinking of that, like, oh,
Yeah,
sorry, Joe.
yeah, for sure. I
We're
mean,
getting a
just
free
from this
masterclass right now.
correct. From this conversation, I can definitely see. I mean, even and then I know you've been keeping it very high level for us and our listeners, and I can definitely see why people would need your services to navigate this very complex and what I would imagine is couldn't be a very stressful process to kind of initiate this new life abroad. I do want to ask, are there any sort of like tips or um, other learnings that our audience can take away from you that we haven't really spoken about today, or at least yet?
So I will say, at what point does it make sense to even start thinking about this, right? So if you're American, I mean, we just kind of covered that. Once you know you're going to be making a certain amount, but if you're not American, it's a lot easier typically to leave your home country. But as I said, there are still considerations where it's a very serious decision. Yes, while you can, in most countries, pretty easily get back into the system. It may take 1 or 2 years, but you can get back into the system. Of course, that usually requires living there and having some other ties to the country. But it is a very serious decision, even though you're not renouncing your citizenship, renouncing your residency, and all the benefits that come along with that. Like I mentioned, healthcare, access to loans. I have a lot of clients who they will become a non-resident, let's say in Canada, Australia, whatnot. And then down the line, a few years, whatnot, they want to purchase a home or they want to, okay, well, the loan environment in a lot of countries around the globe is a lot different than Western countries. Here in Latin America, I mean, loans are essentially not available to most because the interest rate is just usually starting at around 14%. 20% is not unheard of by any means. So yeah, I mean, there are, and then the banking infrastructure too, right? So you have to consider, and this is a piece that I see a lot of clients don't consider until they actually get to this point in the journey where, let's say you're in the Canadian system, you have access to pretty strong, I'm not going to say the best, but pretty strong financial institutions that you hopefully for the most part can trust. In terms of credit, loans, just simple bank accounts, checking, savings. When you get a new residency, that country's banking system may not be and likely won't be as established as a Canada or a US, definitely as the US. So you really want to think about like, where am I doing my daily banking? How can I open a bank account here? We have a lot of clients with residencies throughout Latin America, and then they'll open bank accounts somewhere like Panama because they can do daily banking there. They can have access to really great private banking and bringing their investments from abroad into Panama. But the country where they've gained residency, and let's say Argentina, for example, is not really, I mean, you can have US dollar accounts and euro accounts and Argentine peso accounts, but it's not really somewhere where you want to store your funds long term, and especially not your investments. So, and that is with most countries in Latin America, quite honestly. So there are certain pieces to the puzzle when I see somebody saying like, okay, I've already decided this is the country I want to move to. I'm going to get residency done. Okay, that's no problem. But there are a lot of pieces that to the puzzle that they usually have to consider that is just not really talked about until you go through the entire process. And then you realize like, oh crap, I didn't think of this.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
Man, you have probably been so like I feel like my head's spinning a little bit. I try to stay out of a lot of technical legal aspects when it comes to
Jargon.
travel. Huh? Just
I said
jargon in
legal
general.
jargon. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, this is not a confession, by the way, on the record. So I feel like I don't know, I feel like you've really opened a lot of people's minds to like how they can actually make this a legal transition, becoming a true global citizen or a digital nomad.
Yeah, I'll say this. I love when a guest can provide equal value to not only our audience, but to us as well. Because
Mhm.
when I
Absolutely.
came across your content, it was just like, wait, let me learn about this. Let me read about this a little bit more. And then the rest is history. You're a guest on the Globetrotters. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah. Definitely. So as John said, you've helped a lot of people all over the world invest their money wisely and make these really crazy travel ventures to live abroad. What's next for you? Any new travel destinations or business ventures on the horizon?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've been to quite a few countries now, traveled through some, lived longer term in others. And I really see a lot of opportunity in Latin America. We've been here for about the last 2 years and just can't seem to leave because there is quite a bit of opportunity. I love Asia personally, like Asia's my place. But Latin America is quite interesting. So we're planning to stay here for a bit longer. And there are some new business ventures that are still pretty new. We're not too public about them quite yet, but a few different things that are on the horizon where as we're traveling throughout different countries here, we see a need, an opportunity. And a lot of the times I see companies and businesses that are already established in the US, in Canada, and how beneficial they would be in some countries here in Latin America, but they are just not set up yet. And so I see that as really interesting opportunity. You've just listened to the Worldwise Wealth podcast. Visit our links in the show notes below or at worldwisecapital.com to learn more about how we can assist in your borderless diversification journey. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next episode.